Hi and welcome to the Motorsport Show as the Paul Ricard circuit in the south of France returns to the Grand Prix calendar after a 28-year absence. The traffic snarls were horrendous. The grandstands were temporary and hundreds of yards from the action, and the garages and access roads suddenly seemed strangely disproportionate. No one was unhappy to see France on the Formula One calendar again. Motor racing began in France, let's not forget that, and the country has earned everlasting respect because of that. We'll have tech updates from the Ricard pit lane and also meeting a McLaren design engineer with, wait for it, a smile on his face. But first I'm joined by Autosport.com's editor-in-chief Glenn Freeman for a look back through the highlights. Before we start though, take a look at this. Race 2 of the FIA Formula 3 Championship meeting at Norris Ring last weekend. Dan Ticktum stalls on the grid in his Red Bull car and is rammed massively by India's Ameya Vaidyanathan. Amazingly, both drivers were okay, and Dan went on to win race 3 later that day, can you believe? Anyway, back to the French Grand Prix at Ricard and Glenn Freeman. Glenn, how many points out of 10 do you give Lewis Hamilton then?
It's a 9.5 at worst, isn't it? Phenomenal weekend and a great way to bounce back from what was a really trying weekend for him and the team in Canada.
Interesting talking to him on the Thursday before the race, and it was still Canada still in everybody's mind, and he was saying, oh, different approach now, and we're all wondering, what is this different approach? I mean, one of the things he revealed was that he hadn't even gone near the circuit on a simulator, and he drew the analogy of pre-game shows on TV, of not wanting to spoil the real event by seeing too much in advance. He just wanted to get to Ricard and feel the circuit. And I wonder whether, given all the striping and the runoff areas and the difficulty in sighting the corners, whether Lewis actually did give himself quite a big advantage there, because he was able to just go in and everything was fresh to him, whereas everybody had simulated the circuit, felt kind of lost on that first day. It's
quite old school, I think, to hear a driver say, I just want to get there and learn it for real. And Lewis will have a lot of experience from karting of doing that, because he never had that advantage of sims then. So I think that's very interesting. And drivers can also, I believe, get a bit lost if they rely, as you say, too much on the sim. Yeah. Then you get in the real world and it looks and feels a bit different.
The other two factors, the new power unit that Mercedes ran, and then beyond that, they all went in saying, this isn't a race in which we expect really to do well. We have the shaved tyres, but we think Ferrari are going to be really quick. And that was a slightly different approach to the normal Mercedes, we should be right there, probably behind closed walls. But they went in on the defence and it really worked well for them.
I always thought that it would come back to them, partly because of the shaved tyres and also the engine update. And Lewis said, even if they'd given me a fresh version of the previous engine spec, I'd have felt more confident just with that. So that kind of went against the grain where people say there's no performance drop-off with these engines as their lifespan goes on. Lewis seems to suggest otherwise.
And he talks about how he was looking in his mirrors going into turn 1 and he could see a bit of a getting together between Sebastian and Valtteri, and gave himself as much room as he could going in, which was a nice little bit of detail. But let's move on to that, to what was the defining moment of the race, because in effect Sebastian Vettel took out too many cars and had another incident. And where do you put him now? With a lot of criticism of Max Verstappen over the last few months, but Sebastian does have a bit of a track record now.
I think the key, in terms of making a Verstappen or Vettel comparison, the key now is to see how Sebastian bounces back. You know, we're all really impressed with how Lewis bounced back from just an off the boil weekend in Canada. And Sebastian's just got to wipe it from his mind and move on. It was an error. Whether he took everybody else out is up for debate, but he certainly took Bottas out. And I thought he did try to get out of it, but I thought it was still a bit of a rookie move, really. He got really tucked up behind Lewis. As you say, Lewis could see in his mirrors, like, he's a bit close as we get into the braking zone. And he should have expected Bottas to come around the outside as well. And okay, he got a bit pinched, and they've not done that first corner before, any of these guys in F1, certainly. But yeah, it was clumsy, I think is the best way to describe it.
Or you could say a great move by Bottas as a number 2 to Lewis. Exactly what you want to do, just box a guy in there. And you could see how, just basically Seb just had to come right out of it and everybody was breaking up.
There's the telltale lock-up, wasn't there, where Bottas had done it.
And at that moment, I wouldn't be surprised with a bit of red mist from Sebastian, because he was on the softer tyres, that was his advantage, that was his big moment. And it had gone thanks to this boxing in and bang, straight into the back of Bottas.
And like he said, he arguably made too good a start.
Max Verstappen kept out of trouble. I mean, this is the guy that everyone's on saying just can't keep out of it, but there he was, clean and a very good P2.
A brilliant weekend, had the measure of Ricciardo the whole time. He was on low downforce, Ricciardo was on high downforce. partly because he didn't get a chance to try it in FP3 when it was wet, but Max just delivered all the way through. And really, if we say that Lewis basically did a faultless weekend, I think Max did as well, because the Red Bull Renault package wasn't in the same league as the Mercedes around here.
Let's hear it for Kevin Magnussen. 12 months ago, he wasn't on too many people's horizon, but now he's really, really looking polished and sharp and very consistent.
Yeah, I mean, he's just got that. Now he's got some consistency at a team, and he stayed at a team in Formula One for the first time. And yeah, another, what I call a Class B victory. He looks really comfortable at Haas now, and I think, as I'm sure we're about to come on to, that's maybe putting more of a spotlight on Romain Grosjean, who obviously was the lead driver in that team before. But
yeah, so much pressure for him now to deliver, and he had those terrible races in Baku, and well, Barcelona obviously, and then Baku. And then he looked as if he was kind of redeveloping his style a bit, and Monaco and Canada, he was a little bit quieter, and he thought, oh, he's looking pretty good. And then what was he thinking? I mean, that first lap of Grosjean, I'm still shocked, actually, at what happened. He just drove straight into Ocon off the line. Ocon made the slightly better start, just straight into him at relatively high speed.
The stewards are really unimpressed with that.
Well,
I think they described it as violent, the way he turned.
But the penalty wasn't that bad. And then, to my eye, he definitely was at fault with the Vettel thing. He just moved over on Vettel, hit Vettel, and then, for no reason, drives into the infield. There's nothing in front of him to suggest that he needs to go to the infield.
That's the problem with these big runoffs, though, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah, just straight onto the infield and then rejoins with the momentum to get him in front of Perez.
Yeah.
So Force India won't be exactly happy with Grosjean. Special mention at the end of all this, I think, should go to George Russell, the winner of the feature race in Formula 2 from the pole. Wet, dry conditions, very difficult. Formula 2 cars.
So challenging.
Yeah, and Formula 2 going through a really weird period at the moment in terms of unreliability and is the car going to finish? And he was just superb from beginning to end. And for me, even though it was a Formula 2 race, and sadly most of the spectators left,
as always,
which is a shame because it was brilliant stuff. George Russell was right up there, I think, with any performance we saw all weekend. And you know, this guy, seriously good.
Well, Mercedes F1 protege, knocking on the door as far as I'm concerned.
The Formula One world faces intense pressure over the next couple of weeks as it heads back-to-back from France to Austria and then on to Silverstone for the British Grand Prix. Will technical development take a backseat to the complexity of the logistics? Craig Scarborough has more. Scarb's Red Bull on a roll. They win Monaco and then 2 successive podium finishes in Canada and now in France. What's going on there?
Well, strangely, the Red Bull hasn't changed massively since the beginning of the season. It's been very small little detail changes, which is a bit surprising because the cars obviously seems to be getting more and more competitive as the year's going on. So there's a few bits and pieces that we're just going to have a look at now to kind of catch up on what's been happening with the Red Bull. So if we just bring the car in. First thing is mirrors. Big talking point around Ferrari, obviously. About when they mounted up and thing. Yeah. Red Bull changed their mirrors quite early in the season. They've always had, since last year, a double mounting for the mirror pod, which Red Bull will probably tell you it's structural. Really, this is aerodynamics. They changed this actually at the first race, and you can see they changed the vertical mount to actually go all the way down over the front of the side pod inlet, which is clearly an aerodynamic thing. There's no reason to make it longer to make it work any better. So it just shows you the sort of little level of details. Now, when the FIA was complaining about Ferrari's halo-mounted mirror with the really overt wing, they said they would go back and look at other people's mirror mountings. Red Bull are one, Force India would be another one, which have 3 mounts. Nothing's been done there, which is a bit strange, but we'll let the season continue. So, small change there. Biggest change on the Red Bull really has been in the sort of the barge board area, which continues to be the big area of development. So if we just move on, and quite usefully, we've got most of the other add-ons taken away, and you can see here what they've done. So the Red Bull barge board doesn't look a lot different, but when you start to look at the details, it's got a little bit taller, it's got more and more slots, the floor area has been broken up into more surfaces, and again, more slots and fins, which is kind of the way that everybody's going this year. No one's really coming up with any big new ideas, just breaking up every surface into more and more, and this just allows the barge boards to do their job of breaking the airflow around the car, keeping the front wheel wake away by creating lots of outwash, and it's clearly working for them. The next thing they did when changing these barge boards is what we call the boomerang wing, which is this big black carbon fibre arm. We just move over, you can see. Yeah. This was a bit shorter before, a bit simpler. Now it extends all the way out and mounts to the most outboard elements of the barge board package. And it's kind of strewn with lots of slots in order to shadow holes that are in the floor below. And this what we call, again, this boomerang thing has been very influential. Most of the teams run quite a large element here. and it's really good because it creates some downwash over the rest of the car, so it's directing airflow into the undercut around the side pods, which means it gets around to the diffuser so much more effectively. So all of the teams are running these, and they're getting bigger and bigger, and because the barge boards are below, they're having more and more slots. They're having to put these legality slots in. So lots of changes there. The other area that's really changed is this lower leading edge of the floor. So if we just roll along now, you can see lots of teams over the past few years have had these teeth on the front edge of the floor, and these break up the airflow, and it changes the pressure distribution under the car and also directs some of the airflow out away from under the floor. Red Bull, as we've seen with everything else, they've not really changed it, they just added more of everything. So it just kind of, you're turning the car up to 11 now in terms of the complexity that's around the car. So these bits have been coming over the past few races, and the Red Bull really is showing, despite the power unit, it's definitely one of the best chassis out there.
Scarbs, looking specifically now at the French Grand Prix, heartache for Renault and Carlos Sainz in the closing stages when he lost power. What have you heard about that problem?
As far as we understand, it was the MG UK, which is the part of the hybrid system that we used to call KERS. This is the more reliable of the two MGUs on the car because it's just the kinetic energy recovery one. But Carlos one had a very high mileage. It was his 6th race, so possibly it was getting towards the end of its working life. What's interesting is that we've now found out that Renault have really struggled with their MG UK over the past few years, and they actually had a newer version last season that got rolled back to a 2016 spec to maintain performance and reliability. For Austria, we understand that they finally have this new spec MG UK, which should be quite a big step, although it won't actually add in terms of performance, and it won't increase the power you get because that's capped in the regulations, but it just means that they may be able to regenerate more energy under braking, use it much harder through the race for more reliability.
Not great times for McLaren right now as they come to terms not only with Renault power highlighting fundamental problems with their chassis, but also with Honda looking ever stronger at Toro Rosso and thus Red Bull. So logically, I visited McLaren's headquarters in Woking recently to remind myself of better times and of what McLaren for sure are still capable of if the right engineers are allowed to work with the right facilities. I met, of course, with Neil Oakley, whose imprint is on a multitude of McLaren's championship and race-winning cars. When you walk along the boulevard now and you see the MP44 or this car here, how beautiful or not do they look to you? How near perfection are they?
I think whenever you work on something, you only see the bad points about them, but obviously the cars are so simple now. If you look at the more modern cars, there's a beauty in their simplicity, I think, and that's all we knew at the time. The budgets were a lot smaller, and the use of carbon fibre was still fairly in its infancy in those days. We obviously had it for the chassis and wing components, but allowing us to move into suspension and more complex mouldings, it's just changed the whole nature of the sport. And I think the biggest change nowadays is that the car just evolves a lot race by race, whereas we almost do more in 2 races now than we did in the whole year back in those days. So the whole concept of how you design and evolve the car is very, very different.
Male mould chassis. McLaren, correct me if I'm wrong here, maybe the last team to adapt to female mould?
We were. That was how the original car was conceived back in 1981 when John Barnard did that first carbon chassis, and it worked quite well for us. So we continued with that up until the 1991 car, and then we changed for 1992. So I think we were the only people making it in that manner in those days. So perhaps it became a little bit old-fashioned at that point, but it was quite an easy design and manufacturing process, and allowed us to concentrate more on some of the other aspects of the car.
And you were around McLaren when the active ride systems began to develop?
We only ever raced an active car in 1993.
And why was that?
We'd been working on a project with Honda in that period, and that was very, very slow moving, to be fair. It was a very complex system, not unlike the system Lotus were using, and it just took a long time to get some energy into it. Then Honda disappeared, so we had to do something fairly quickly ourselves, and we literally in the space of 2 or 3 months we designed and built an active system, a lot simpler version, which was just ready in time to run on the first test with the 93 car, and we raced that for the whole year. But it was very simple but very easy to work with, and I think by the end of the year we'd honed that to perfection really, and the car was actually a lot quicker as a chassis, I think, than the Williams was, which had a much more complex system.
And what is your view now on Active Ride potentially having a role to play again in Formula One?
Oh, it'd be interesting. I think as an engineer, you always like as many toys to play with as the authorities will allow you. And in some ways, it might be good for the sport to help bring cars closer together on performance. I think that's to be proven, but I think that's probably where the benefit will be. I think if you look at the end of '93, there were 4 or 5 teams that were very, very close on performance, and the racing was actually quite good.
But can you refresh my memory as to why they actually banned it? Was it because of potential speed, or was it the cost and the complication, or both?
I think probably both, and obviously that was evolving along with more complex systems. I mean, Benetton had introduced an active steering system on the rear of their cars, for instance, so I think the whole thing was starting to escalate. I think one of the potential downsides of it does allow you to build a more sensitive race car but control it by electronics.
Yeah.
So that may or may not be a good thing. That's still to be debated, I think, for how that might go forward to 2021.
And if we look at these cars here now, and other cars with which you've been involved, can I ask you again, any soft spots in terms of walking along the boulevard, cars you warm to your heart?
I think my favourite car of the ones I've been directly involved in is probably the '93 car, which partly for the reasons we've just been talking about with the Active Ride, but it had a lot of toys and interesting mechanical devices on it, which were all banned at the end of that year. And it was a relatively simple car, despite that, relatively cheap to make. But it was just a good car. It wasn't the most successful car, but I think it was, as an engineer, it was probably the nicest car that we did in that period. The cars I haven't been involved with, I think the Can-Am car down at the end there is one. I just love those big V8.
You never went to a Can-Am race, I guess, in the Canada or America?
Not in North America, just those type of cars before, while they still raced in England, which have been up to 67.
In terms of how you've evolved as an engineer, am I correct in saying packaging may be one of your fortes? When an aerodynamicist comes to you and says, we need to be able to get this shape, this is what the problem we got with the radiators and the intercooler, or whatever it is, Neil Oatley's your man?
Probably would have been. Obviously, I haven't actually been hands-on doing that sort of work for a long time now. But again, I think if you look at the cars, like the one beside us here, that there's a huge amount of space in the side pods, and the cars were a lot less complex, and it was still largely drawn by hand. So you had to allow for much bigger clearances. But I think if you look at 2018 car, the packaging to me is absolutely unbelievable. The job that guys have done in putting a lot of complex systems and components into an incredibly small aerodynamic space is actually wonderful, and you couldn't have done that with a small staff of people and drawing by hand.
The second leg of Formula One's first triple header takes place in Austria this weekend in the much shortened circuit born of the magnificent, fast and undulating Österreich Ring. Today's Red Bull Ring is more of a TV track than it is legendary venue, lack of overtaking opportunities aside, but it still has some plus points. This Austrian circuit, nestling in the footholds of the Alps, has a big history going back to 1964. Race not held actually on this circuit, but on the airfield, the military airfield just behind it in the little town of Zeltweg. 64 Austrian Grand Prix, won by Lorenzo Bandini. Most of the others all dropped out because the surface was so rough. This actual venue was born in 1970, the first Austrian Grand Prix at the Österreich Ring staged that year. That was the year famously that Frank Williams, although he had his own Formula One team, sported a t-shirt saying, Jochen Rindt to be world champion. Go for it, Frank. And then it went on. 1975, a half points race. Of course, we lost Mark Donoghue that year. Here's a picture of me watching in the infield. The actual infield section hasn't changed that much, unlike me. But it's not exactly the same corners, but nonetheless, you get the same feel, same flow. 1982, Elio De Angelis beat Keke Rosberg by 0.05 seconds, closest finished ever in Formula One history. 1987 was the year Nigel Mansell memorably crashed his head into the top of the awning as he's getting up to the podium. And afterwards, Murray Walker said, "Is this where you hit yourself, Nigel?" pressing him right on the bruise. You can imagine what happened next. Anyway, to today's race. This circuit has undergone various changes. It doesn't look that interesting, I guess, in the form in which you see it here, but there are 1 or 2 corners that do bring the best out in the drivers. First thing I should point out is that there are now 3 DRS zones. This third one has just been added very recently. And unlike Canada, I don't think it will hurt the race because this is a higher downforce circuit. Whether it will actually improve overtaking will remain to be seen. It's a very, very difficult circuit on which to overtake. Now let's have a look now at the elevation of this Red Bull Ring. It's pretty high, which means that the air's a bit thinner, downforce is less, the brakes are going to have to work harder because they're going to be hotter. So there are a lot of mechanical issues going on here. Don't forget also it's a circuit about traction and about top speed. Those things very important. So Mercedes, Ferrari possibly will have an advantage over Red Bull, but it's difficult to imagine that Red Bull chassis will not be really quick around this circuit. Looking at the circuit in more detail now, turn 1 is a little bit like the first corner in Austin, but goes the other way, of course. Very steep uphill braking area. You can't see the apex. An interesting first corner as well. That's why I call this circuit a sort of TV circuit as much as it is anything else. Also note that pit lane exit on the right there. In itself, if you're on a quick lap, no problem for the car rejoining. But that is a very sharp right-hander at the end of the pit lane exit, and many a quick driver has had a moment there, and some even have had a spin there. Remain nameless, of course. So accelerate out of turn 1. That is where the new DRS activation zone will be. So hopefully there'll be more overtaking there, as I say. Braking now for turn 2. Very, very difficult braking area because the car is coming through that left kink. It's very easy to get an inside run there, but equally you want to be on the racing line. There are a few bumps you have to watch. Smoother now than they were a few years ago, but nonetheless a very, very difficult braking area. Having said that, in terms of grip mid-corner, you can be offline going through that right-hander and still not lose much ground. It's got a nice wide exit and you can get away with it. Fernando Alonso had a big shunt coming out of there. And don't forget also that a massive shunt that Nick Heidfeld caused when he had cold brakes after a restart going into turn 2 and T-boned Takuma Sato, who at that stage was driving for the Jordan. Neither driver seriously injured, but a very nasty moment after a restart with cold brakes. Anyway, heading out of turn 2 now, turns 3, 4, 5 really are the characteristic corners of the Red Bull Ring. Beautiful section of road, plunging downhill, and then a bit of a rise as you come out of turn 5 towards 6 and 7. 7 is a flat-out right-hand kink. Out of 7, plunging downhill into what used to be the Jochen Rindt curve, just one final loop. That's now basically been subdivided into 2 right-handers, both of which require tough braking. It's what they would call, I guess, a technical circuit. I've never really understood what that term means, but I guess it means you've got to get the braking absolutely perfect. As you accelerate out of the last corner, an historic moment. Lovely part of the world to be. Mountains on the right, history of the Austrian Grand Prix. I think a lot of us still remember, however, 2002, this is the moment when Rubens Barrichello backed off to give the win to Michael Schumacher. And that kind of changed the world for a while in terms of team orders. Back to square one now, but at the time, it was a big deal. That's all for this week's show. Let's close with a personal look at the French Grand Prix as it returned to the Formula One calendar on the Circuit Paul Ricard for the first time in 28 years. See you next week as we look back at the Austrian Grand Prix.